Bias can take many forms. We're all familiar with overt forms of bias, like separate drinking fountains. But the most insidious forms of bias, I think, are the most invisible. And one form of bias that pervades the teaching of history is a focus on the Northeast and the exclusion of the West, and especially the Southwest. And that's a bias that we're going to try to rectify today by focusing on the southwestern borderlands, and particularly on two groups of people who are often excluded from our contemporary consciousness: Mexican Americans and Native Americans. We are extremely fortunate today to have an award-winning historian of the Mexican American experience, Professor Emilio Zamora. His book, The World of the Mexican Worker in Texas, has won many, many prizes. It has won the T.R. Fehrenbach Award of the Texas State Historical Society. It has won the Mitchell Award of the Southern Historical Association. Professor Zamora has also won prizes from the Western Historical Association. Few historians have earned so many awards so quickly in their career. It is a great pleasure to invite Professor Zamora to speak to you.
Thank you very much. The purpose of my presentation is to introduce you to Mexican American history, a relatively new field of study in American history. It begins around the late 60s and early 70s with the production of theses and dissertations, articles, and some books in the early 70s. Since then, quite a bit of material has been produced. There is a great interest in the history of Mexicans in the U.S. for a number of reasons. The population group has great significance contemporarily as well as historically for this country, in particular the region of the Southwest, where they have predominated since the late 19th century. They're also important. The history of Mexican people is also important because it speaks to some extent to the history of Mexico and its relationship with the U.S. And it's important for many other reasons. What I want to do today is first give you a description of the subject being the history of Mexican origin people in the United States. Who are these people that we are studying? And in the process, I hope to communicate what I think is significant about studying this population group. I will give you somewhat of a demographic profile of the population, followed with more historical factors that describe that Mexican population. I then will provide you a periodization scheme. We historians study history according to historical periods that stand out because of something unique that occurred during that historical period. In Mexican American history, we also use what we call a periodization scheme, that is, a general outline. So I want to share with you what I think is the basic periodization scheme that most people use, or most people use variations of this periodization scheme. I then want to focus on the subject by addressing the period between 1900 and 1945, the period that most interests me, particularly the Mexican historical experience in the state of Texas. I then will conclude with some remarks about Mexican American history with two themes in mind: identity and mobility. So what is this subject? What do we mean when we say that we study the history of the Mexican people? Contemporarily, we can describe the population with the use of some very familiar demographic factors. The Mexican population is part of a larger Latino population. The Latino population in this country is at least somewhere between 22 and 25 million people, a very sizable population. The Mexican origin portion of that large population constitutes over 65%. So when we speak about the Latino population in contemporary terms, we are speaking to a great extent about the Mexican origin population. So it is a good-sized population. It is very young. It is a very young population relative to other groups in this country. It has been growing at a very fast rate. In Houston, for example, since 1940, the Mexican population has doubled in size every 10 years until 1990. In 1990, they increased by 2/3. So they're a young population, which contributes to their very fast growth rate. A very large population. They have a particular significance, demographically speaking, in areas, of course, where they are concentrated, in areas like the Southwest, but also in cities outside the Southwest, like Chicago, for example, and other places. Now, demographically, they're pretty visible, and they are significant, and this serves to justify studying the history of this people. There's other important considerations that I think help us understand this population, the reason why we study it. For the most part, it is a minority population. When we speak about a minority population, we're speaking about power relations. Though they may constitute a majority in certain areas, they have unequal access to power. Consequently, their numbers don't necessarily translate into political power. They're politically powerless. Educationally, they also rank very low relative to other population groups. About 12% of the 25 years and over Mexican population has a 5th grade education. 53% have high school diploma or higher among the population that are 25 years and older, and only 9% of them graduate from college. These figures are not very impressive when one compares them with the figures relative to other population groups. Income, occupation, any other socioeconomic indicator you may want to select will underscore the point that I'm making. The Mexican-American population is a powerless group. It is a minority, in other words, minority population, and it represents a significant part of the lower working class population. That is not to say that all Mexican Americans are farm workers, or all Mexican Americans are unskilled workers in manufacturing firms. There are increasing numbers of Mexicans that are able to obtain high school and college educations and enter the professional ranks. All I'm saying is that the great majority of Mexicans relative to the larger population are overly represented in the bottom occupational ranks and the bottom educational levels. So we're talking about a politically powerless bottom segment of the working class for the most part. There are historical factors that also help us define the subject that we study, a number of them. First of all, the territory in which they have predominated, which is the Southwest, and the community that they build in the U.S. are the result of a war and its legacy. Although Mexican-American history, in my mind, begins in the late 1600s and early 1700s, when the present-day Southwest is colonized and settled, many people begin this history in 1848. In other words, the history has a distant origin. Okay? We most often, however, begin this history in 1848. 1848 is important because it It is a year in which the war between Mexico and the U.S. ends. The war results in Mexico ceding to the U.S. more than one half of its territory. Mexican origin people residing in the Southwest, anywhere from 50 to 100,000 people, chose, many of them between 50 and 100,000, chose to remain in the Southwest once the new international border between the U.S. and Mexico is established. The war, in other words, is very much a part of the history of these people. Not only the war between Mexico and the U.S., but prior to that, the war in Texas, that results in the independence of Texas. So their birth is a very difficult birth. It is a birth characterized by war and, very importantly, the violent legacy of the war. Although the war between Mexico and the U.S. ends in 1848, the violence continues. And I'll talk about that in a little while. Right now, what I'm doing is defining the subject. So the war is important, defining who these people are. The community is set off racially from other sectors of society. Historically, we see that race has been a factor in defining who the Mexicans are and in defining who the non-Mexicans are, in effect, in defining the relations between people. Now, you may say, well, Mexicans do not necessarily represent a distinct phenotype. They don't have racial characteristics that are radically different from the majority of the population. Let me remind you that when we speak about the racial categories, we're talking about socially constructed categories. It rarely matters whether there is a sharp physical contrast between people for individuals to use racial categories to define who they are and who other people are. So race has been used to define social relations historically between Mexicans and others in the United States. Another factor that is important in helping understand who Mexicans are historically is their culture and identity. Their culture is a syncretic culture. It is a result of a process of borrowing. We most often associate this process of acculturation, to use a current day term, with the experiences of Mexicans in the 20th century, Mexicans who were becoming Americanized. Acculturation is a broader process that has involved also a great deal of borrowing and exchange within the Mexican population, within the Mexican communities. During the colonial period, for example, different groups are involved in these colonization efforts of the Southwest. Different Native Americans from different parts of Mexico, current-day Mexico, come in and join with different Native Americans in the Southwest. These people then join with other people with a different background. There's been a constant intermixture in the Mexican population throughout history. Their culture clearly is a syncretic culture. There has been intense conflict in numerous areas in their history. The history of Mexican Americans is characterized by a great degree of conflict. What do we mean by conflict? Well, there's various kinds of conflict. Armed conflict, for example, associated with the Mexican-American War. Armed violence that occurs immediately after the war. The war ends, but the violence continues, as I said earlier. There's a great deal of conflict in work areas. Mexican workers, for the most part, throughout the 20th century are paid very low wages. Mexican workers, like any other worker, under those kinds of circumstances, tend to seek to improve their condition. This results in serious conflicts in the economic arena, and so forth. Conflict is an important theme. Economically, the majority of the Mexicans have been laborers. and they have worked for low wages. This is another very important historical factor that defines the subject. Especially during the 20th century, Mexicans are concentrated in the lower segment of the working class. And they are, for the most part, assuming the lower or semi-skilled jobs in agriculture, mining, and transportation, and working, of course, for low wages, oftentimes regardless of the skills that they have. There's also prolonged subordination in the community, another factor that sets it apart from many other groups during that time period. What do we mean by subordination? Primarily that Mexicans are denied, generally speaking, throughout the 20th century, opportunities to move upward in the occupational structure, for example. They remain in the bottom with few opportunities to move out and up. Thus, we say they are subordinated. So, demographically, in contemporary terms, we see that the group is a sizable group, concentrated in significant numbers, experiencing a very impressive growth rate. Given their young age, this trend clearly is going to continue. Their growth rate is going to be probably one of the most impressive ones among population groups in this country into the 21st century. Historically, we can justify giving attention to this population because of very key historical factors that have to do with the war, with their homeland area, which is the Southwest, the theme of conflict, subordination, and so forth. A number of reasons that justify examining this group. Now, how do we go about studying a group like this? Well, the obvious thing to do, of course, is to look at the historical period. Roughly, what I want to do today is deal with the period 1848 to the Second World War, focus on the period between 1900 and 1945. An author by the name of Mario Garcia offers, I think, the best periodization scheme, the most useful periodization scheme because of its clarity. And I'd like to share that with you today. He argues that the period from 1848 to 1900 is he calls it the conquered generation. He defines these periods in terms of the generations, in terms of generations of people. In his mind, this is the initial generation that gives birth to the Mexican population. I personally do not agree with the argument that Mexican-American history begins in 1848. How can we say that the history of people begins with the signing of a treaty between two countries? It's not so. It begins much earlier. For the purposes of our discussion, with the limited amount of time that we have, we will start with 1848, as Mario Garcia suggests. When he then coins this phrase, this label, the conquered generation, he is in effect saying that this is the first generation of Mexican Americans who, as a result of the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, officially become an ethnic minority, thus the birth of the Mexican American population. The conquered generation period spans between 1848 and 1900, begins with the end of the Mexican-American War, and it ends roughly around the turn of the century. Why those kinds of points? Well, we know I've already explained 1848. 1900, 1880, 1890, 1900, that time period is a logical point to make a break. In part because the Southwest undergoes a major process of industrialization. The economy grows, it expands, it makes available new jobs. This results in drawing large numbers of Mexicans from Mexico, to the point that by the turn of the century, the great majority of Mexicans are working for wages. So the industrialization of the economy introduces profound changes in the history of Mexicans. Okay, so those are the two things that set this period apart from the other periods. What occurs during the period 1848 to 1900? What occurs before this major process of industrialization? Well, one of the things that occurs is that the Mexican population undergoes, the Mexican social structure undergoes a radical transformation. Despite the war, despite the fact that the war forced many people to leave as political exiles to go into Mexico, many did remain. Many of these people, of course, are owners of ranches and farms. Some are artisans. Some are involved in fledgling industries like the transportation industries. What we have then is a pretty well-stratified society, a society composed at the very top of large landowners, under them small, medium-sized landowners, and then artisans and so forth. It's a stratified society. The pressure of the war, in effect, collapsed the social structure so that we're left by 1900 with only laborers. How does this occur? It occurs in a number of ways, but it always involves violence. There is intense competition for resources and violence, particularly in areas of intense economic activity, like Northern California. Gold is rediscovered in 1848. Large numbers of people come in, begin to compete with the Mexicans for gold. They are pushed out of the mines. The miners then need beef. Beef production becomes very profitable. Intense competition occurs there. Mexicans are moved out of that industry. The transportation industry becomes very important as the regional economy of the Southwest is being incorporated into the national economy. Intense competition over control over the carts, the carts that are transporting the goods in various directions throughout the Southwest. What results is that the land is transferred away from Mexican hands. Okay? Mine ownership is transferred away from Mexican hands. The control over the transportation industry and other industries is lost. The Mexican landowners disappear. They no longer are there as landowners. Business people, entrepreneurs, they disappear. So that at the same time that the economy, beginning around the 1880s, in the Southwest, begins to develop very rapidly, at that very same time, Mexicans are not available to make use, are not available to participate in the economy, but as laborers. Okay? This has great, far-reaching consequences. The Mexicans that own the carts that transport goods from Chihuahua to Santa Fe, to San Antonio, to Galveston, are forced out of the business. These are the people that could have invested in the development of the railroad industry in the 1880s and the 1890s. They no longer are there, so Mexicans cannot participate in the development of the railroad industry, but as laborers, laying the tracks and maintaining the tracks. So there's a major, not only economic transformation, but there's also a social transformation occurring in the Southwest. Mexicans come out of the 19th century then largely a working class population. The growth and development of the economy creates a demand for low-wage labor. Low-wage Mexican labor then is drawn in to meet that demand. That reinforces then the Mexicans' bottom position in the social economy. So, the legacy of the war, with its continuing violence and conflict, plus the way in which the economy is transformed, results in placing the Mexicans at the very bottom. Now you may say, well, blind market forces most probably resulted in placing Mexicans at the very bottom. Maybe this demand for cheap labor could only be met by Mexicans without any skills. Things don't work that neatly. We know that representatives of railroad companies, ranch owners associations, and others, they actively sought out, actively recruited Mexicans to fill low-wage positions. In other words, the recruitment efforts are clearly discriminatory and influence the way in which society is going to be organized. Mexicans are being recruited not to work as firemen on the railroads, but to work as on the maintenance of way crews, you see. They're not being recruited to come and build small and medium-sized farms. They're being recruited to come and clear the land for others to farm. Okay? The recruitment efforts and many other things point to the fact that people are actively involved in shaping the social structure, and that race plays a role in all of this. I am moving kind of quick. If you have any questions, please stop me. I'll be happy to answer them. Yes?
How does the idea about Mexican Americans being actively recruited as bottom rung laborers intersect with the idea of the American dream and the American self-made millionaire? Like an individual comes over this country with $2 in his pocket and ends up running a huge business.
How do you reconcile that? Opportunities exist, have existed in this country for many, many people. One of the things that I'm suggesting that sets the experiences of Mexicans apart from others is that they are not seen as individuals. They're not treated as individuals. This is what is at the heart of discrimination, which is racially defined, that people are not seen as individuals, but are treated as part of a general population group, that are treated as a group that can meet a demand. It speaks to very distant relations between employers and workers, a very impersonal kind of relationship. There are opportunities for people. There are some Mexicans that do make use of opportunities. There are Mexican-American merchants that are able to maintain their businesses despite all these problems. Some start anew even in the early 1900s. But these are very rare occurrences. What sets the experiences of Mexicans apart from other groups in other parts of the country is that they're continually, over time, excluded from these opportunities as a whole. I think that's what is important.
It almost sounds like to me that you're saying that the landowners and the railroad company owners and the transportation directors and everybody were intentionally socially engineering the country. I'm wondering if is that more of a perspective that we're placing onto the situation of the time period, or do you really think there was that much of an intention to socially engineer this country in that way, or were they just making use of the knowledge that they had at the time and applying it in the way that they knew how?
I'm not suggesting that there's some cultural deficiencies on the part of these people who actively sought Mexicans to fill low-wage jobs. I'm not suggesting anything in a cultural way. In fact, what is occurring is are economic motivations. I mean, these people aren't getting up in the morning and saying, I wonder how many Mexicans I can do under today. I think they're thinking in economic terms. They're not thinking, I want to get a Mexican to fix the tracks because Mexicans are the only ones that can do it, though some do provide that justification. But I think the primary justification is an economic justification. Let me give you some examples of what I mean. In the early 1900s, as the economy is taking off, speculators come into places like South Texas, places like Southern California. They begin to buy land, and they develop it to some extent with Mexican labor, but by and large. Then they make this land available to to Midwestern farmers who come in large numbers. The speculators paint a wonderful picture to these Midwestern farmers who invest their entire, in many instances, life savings into the purchase of the farms. When they come, many of them, of course, learn very quickly that Mexicans are to do the laboring work. But even if they were opposed to the idea of doing that, economic circumstances oftentimes dictate behavior. They come in a place like South Texas, they've spent all their money buying farms at inflated prices. They come in, they really don't have any money to pay the laborers more than what is already being paid. There are factors like this that reinforce inequality. I'm not suggesting that in all instances it's a pure racial motivation that explains why people act the way they do. Well, I think in most instances economic motivations join with racial justifications to give us what we then call racial discrimination. To give you another example, there was a town in central Texas called Kyle City, established by European immigrants in the middle 1800s, 1850s. Like many other communities in central Texas, this community was a pretty impressive community. People had come in as families, and people from the same village. They had pooled their resources, worked very hard, built their churches, their schools, their homes, barns, and so forth. In the early 1900s, however, large farming operations was driving the price of cotton down and forcing many of these small and medium-sized farmers who had worked very hard to set up their operations, forcing them out of business. The large growers were using, guess what, to drive the price of cotton down? They were using Mexican labor, mass Mexican labor. What do the small and medium-sized farmers do? Well, they become very resentful that they're losing their farms, not only their farms, their way of life, to these large planters using Mexican labor. Anti-Mexican ideas, we think, emerge in large part because of this intense competition in the economic arena and the economic motivations that explain why people define social relations the way they do. Some of these young people then go to urban areas, and they go with very deep-seated resentments directed against Mexicans. When the Mexicans then start going into the urban areas, as they do in the 1910s and 1920s, a lot of these young people become very, very jealous about the jobs that they have, some that are unionized. So you have strong anti-Mexican ideas directed against Mexicans in the 1910s and the 1920s as a result of these large influx of Mexican workers. So there's economic motivations for the most part. So the early 1900s initiates the second period that we call the immigrant generation, or the Mexicanist generation. And I'll explain that in a minute. This is a very important term in my mind, the Mexicanist term. I'll explain it in a minute. But the immigrant generation is that second period, and it is characterized by intense economic development, a dramatic increase in the numbers of people migrating in and out of Texas, a dramatic increase in the numbers of people that decide to set up permanent residence in the Southwest, and of course a corresponding increase in the numbers of Mexican origin people in the Southwest. The population increases as a result of immigration. And immigration is a result of a transformation of the economy, the availability of more low-skilled jobs and low-paying jobs and so forth. So immigration is very central to this. Again, immigration is tied to economic growth. Immigration contributes to the growth of the population. The concentration of the population in places like South Texas, Southern California. It also explains the emergence of new communities outside the Southwest. When these people migrate from Mexico into places like Texas, many of them continue migrating further in. the communities in Kansas City, Missouri, Chicago, Mexican communities in Chicago, and other places in Michigan and Indiana originate around this period. Immigration is very, very important for all of those reasons. One of the things that I like to do is to treat the question of identity and mobility. I think these are themes that become particularly important for the Mexican population beginning in the early 1900s. What do we mean by identity? Well, what I mean is the ideas that people use to define who they are as a group. That process is also occurring at an individual level, at a family level, at a community level. But in general terms, what is contributing to this, to defining the Mexican American population? It's a very important process. Keep in mind that immigration is bringing in people very suddenly, in great numbers, and concentrating them in localities like Laredo. Laredo in 1901 starts off with about 3,000–4,000 people. By 1910, it's tripled and quadrupled in size. There's communities that triple and quadruple in size in 10 years. Imagine all these people coming in from different places, now living next to each other. Okay? What does this mean? It means that the community has to undergo a process of defining who they are. It's a very dynamic process. Now, why do we focus on what is happening internally? In part because, in my mind, the Mexican community during this early period of the 1900s up to 1930 is in many ways very distant from the larger community. There's great distance between the Mexican community and the non-Mexican community, in part because they're residentially segregated, regionally segregated, occupationally segregated. There's distance. Culturally, there's great distance. The language also serves to separate people significantly. So the acculturation that is occurring within the Mexican American community for the most part. And what's going on there? But one of the things that is particularly important is what I call a working class, the development of a working class culture. I borrow quite liberally from the writings of many others. These are not my ideas, but this general agreement that the working class is almost in a fixed state of crisis. Poor people, when in a crisis, tend to want to come together, to join, to try to resolve problems collectively, to try to survive the problems by sharing resources. That's not to say that there aren't any other identities or ideologies operating, individualistic ones, for example. But the collective becomes very, very important for poor people. We can understand it when we look at a family, for example, that suffers the loss of someone in the family. Someone dies. Everybody comes together and at least emotionally gives each other support. It's a natural tendency. It operates at the group level as well. We see it in the Mexican American community. What are the values then that result from this kind of crisis? I call them mutualist values, the values that promote mutualism, cooperativism, even altruism. And the organizations that are most involved in the promotion and reinforcement of mutualist values in the Mexican American community are the mutual aid societies, or the benevolent organizations that we also see in other histories. These organizations haven't been studied enough. We are beginning to study them in Mexican American history and beginning to understand how important they are, not only in terms of numbers, there are very large numbers of them, but in terms of defining the Mexican American identity, or the Mexican identity, what I call the Mexicanist identity.
Could you give me a couple of examples of what these mutual aid societies might be?
There's a number of them. In fact, according to one researcher in 1929, a fellow by the name of Recinos, sociologist from Mexico, he claimed that in his visits to communities throughout the Southwest, any community of an appreciable size had numerous mutual aid societies. Mutual aid societies, again, benevolent organizations, were very Mexican in that Spanish was spoken, Mexican patriotic celebrations were observed, the interests of the community were promoted, and so forth. They were usually named after important historical figures, like Benito Juárez, who has been compared to Abraham Lincoln in this country. Sociedad de Beneficencia, the social welfare organization, Benito Juárez. There's one in Laredo that I've studied that was established in the 1880s that still exists today. Sociedad de Obreros, Igualdad y Progreso, Worker Society, Equality and Progress. There's organizations here in Houston that trace their history back to the early 1900s. The mutual aid societies were the most numerous organizations in the Mexican-American community. They promoted mutualist values in many ways, and they reflected them in many ways. They did it by celebrating the patriotic holidays, okay, giving people a cultural reference. This is who you are. You are Mexicans. This is what they were communicating. This is your history. This is the kind of stuff that you need to think about. And what values were being communicated when they celebrated the patriotic holidays? Civic responsibility, service to the fatherland, and so forth. They also are the organizations that established private schools. Many public schools denied Mexican-American children admission. One of the things that the benevolent organizations did is they set up their own private schools for the children, in which Spanish and English were taught, U.S. and Mexican history were taught. So in that way, they're promoting a Mexicanist identity, an identity as a Mexican, and mutualist values of caring for each other. There's a number of other ways. Let me just give you another example of how they promote the values. They promote values by offering basic services to the members and to the general community. Basic services. If a member died, and usually the members were male, if a member died, the organization would then make available, would support the widow and the children. Okay? It's an important service. By doing that, they were demonstrating how a Mexican ought to be. A Mexican should help others, should make sure that the entire group comes together. The rules that the organizations adopted were very strict and promoted frugality, promoted respectful behavior with each other, promoted a sense of civic responsibility. Anyone, and at least in the organizations that I've studied, any member who was accused of being an alcoholic and an irresponsible family member would be asked to leave the organization. Any member who used profanity, that is, who was disrespectful to a fellow member during a meeting, would also be asked to leave the organization. They're very moralistic, and they're very Mexicanist. They're very moralistic in the sense that they're promoting mutualist values. They're promoting the idea of doing for others as one would expect them to do for us. Okay? And they're promoting the sense of being Mexican. This is why I use the term Mexicanist. They used it quite a lot. One of the most important meetings that occurs in the early 1900s, one of the most important political meetings that tells us a lot about political activity in the early 1900s was the Mexicanist Conference held in Laredo in 1911. A man by the name of Nicasio Hidar, his son Clemente, and his daughter Jovita. Very important family. I'd like to pause here a bit and talk about them. A very important, politically prominent family from Laredo was publishing a newspaper in the early 1900s. and often spoke about the problems Mexicans were facing. In 1910, the patriarch Nicasio and his son and daughter issued a call to all the Mexican organizations in the state of Texas that send delegates to discuss the problems in the Mexican-American community. The speeches have survived, so we have a very reliable source of information that gives us an idea about the major concerns about these very representative individuals that are very active in their communities. What are the issues? Well, first of all, the call and then the welcome by the Idares tell us a lot. Nicasio Idar welcomed the delegates as the apostles of goodness. It doesn't sound as good in English, but that's the direct translation. The apostles of goodness, the people that are working on behalf of what is good, the purveyors of truth, those that seek justice for the Mexican people. Anyway, what are the issues? The issues involve economic exploitation. They're particularly concerned about the low wages and long working hours that Mexican workers are enduring. Labor exploitation is a serious, serious issue. Educational discrimination in the public schools is another very important issue. According to them, if we cannot guarantee the next generation the means by which to transcend our condition, everything will be for naught. So education is very important. It's very important that children are provided a public school education. It's not enough for them to receive a private school education. It's necessary to have a public school education. Violence against young male adults in legal custody is another very serious issue. Many young male adults arrested on a number of charges would face a great deal of violence, sometimes lynchings. That was another issue. Women's rights was another issue. All right. There are many organizations, and again, in the little time that we have, I'm sorry we can't possibly deal with all of this, but suffice it to say that this meeting is a very representative meeting of the political landscape in the Mexican-American community. There are large numbers of organizations out there that are very active around these issues. Efforts are made to build regional unity. This is one important effort in 1911 in Laredo with the Mexicanist Conference. That attempt to build unity is based on this Mexicanist identity, one that underscores Mexican origin, and it is also very moralistic, one which emphasizes mutualist values, this need to do for others so that the group can survive and possibly even advance. The period ends in 1930 with the beginning of the Depression, and the community enters another period. The period from 1930 to 1960 we characterize as the Mexican-American generation. One of the reasons why it is characterized as the Mexican-American generation is because one of the most prominent political organizations in the Mexican-American community defines its politics in ethnic, that is, Mexican-American terms. Whereas Mexicans prior to 1930 looked to the homeland for identity and political inspiration and political alliances, look inwardly for the resolution of a number of problems. Beginning in the 1930s, the Mexican community, primarily through LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, the organization that gives definition to the period from 1930 and 1960, the Mexican-American generation. What introduces, why this change? Why is it that we go from being from a community that politically expresses a Mexicanist identity to one that now represents itself as a Mexican-American community? Why is it that now an organization like LULAC begins to engage the larger society on a number of issues, including acculturation, political rights, workers' rights? What happens? Well, what happens is that the Mexican-American population undergoes important changes. There are some Mexicans that do experience some mobility in the 1910s, that experience some acculturation in the direction of the larger society. They learn English, they learn other skills that make them effective in the larger society. They then see the opportunity to use their nativity as a basis, the fact that they're born in this country, as a basis to leverage changes for themselves and the larger population. In other words, by the 1910s and the 1920s, there was a sufficient number of acculturated Mexican-American professionals and entrepreneurs that they can build an organization that argues an ethnic argument for incorporation. That is, allow Mexicans to enter the society on equal terms on the grounds that they are U.S. born. They make, of course, constant reference to the Constitution and the rights guaranteed them by the Constitution. Of course, you don't have to be born in this country to have constitutional rights, but they do give great emphasis to their constitutional rights in the same breath as they claim the right to be treated equally because they're born here. This occurs in the 1930s at the same time that LULAC is promoting the idea of acculturating, and in fact telling Mexicans the way to gain entry into the society, the way to be accepted on equal terms at the barber shop, at the job site, is to demonstrate a willingness to become a part of the society. It's an argument, a strategy that continues to this day. Not everyone agreed with it. In the middle of the Depression, there are a significant number of people that are arguing that it is not enough for Mexicans to acculturate. It's necessary to force changes. The period of the 30s, like the 1910s, registers intense political activity across the political spectrum. It doesn't only include political activity in the Mexican-American community, it doesn't only include LULAC and its accommodationist strategy. It also includes labor organizations associated with the CIO, for example, in the 1930s, the very famous labor federation challenging the American Federation of Labor for supremacy in this country. The CIO in the 1930s built an oppositional strategy against the AFL in a number of ways. And not only the leadership of the CIO not only embraced ideas that spoke about reorganizing society, what made them radical in the minds of many people is that they also went out to organize previously unattended workers in the Southwest and Mexicans. The CIO opened its doors to Mexican workers. Mexican workers in the 1930s entered the CIO in very impressive numbers. So the CIO challenge of the AFL involved the participation of Mexicans very prominently. So the 1930s, though characterized by this new ethnic Mexican-American brand of politics, is characterized by serious political divisions in the Mexican-American community. There's extreme hardship experienced by Mexicans during the Depression. The Depression is a very horrible experience for people in this country. It is especially disturbing for people that are already destitute. This is a reason why we attach extreme to the word hardship when describing the Mexican experience during the Depression. One way to illustrate this, there are many ways to illustrate this, but one way to illustrate this is by pointing to the deportations that occurred during the 1930s. During the 1930s, increasing numbers of people believed that the few resources that were available in this country should be shared only by those that were born here. Secondarily, people also believed that the folks that were coming in from Mexico were threatening to depress wages further and even displace workers from their jobs. The Depression, particularly in the Southwest, is characterized by increased anti-Mexican feelings which justify large-scale deportations of Mexicans. And this is the example that we use to support the claim that Mexicans experienced extreme hardship during the Depression. The Mexicans, like other people, came out of the Depression as a result of the growth and development of the wartime economy. Beginning around 38 and 39, the economy expands, new jobs are made available to people, jobs that pay better, in many instances more secure jobs, in part because they're unionized. Mexicans also participate in this recovery. But something now emerges that is very important during the First World War, and that is uneven development. Okay? Uneven development is an important concept that helps us understand why the Mexican population, why we can say on the one hand that there is continuing discrimination and obstacles to mobility, while at the same time acknowledging that some Mexicans are able to experience some mobility. How do you account for those seemingly contradictory processes? They're not contradictory. What we have is a process of uneven development. Some Mexicans make full use of some opportunities. Other Mexicans don't have similar opportunities. The great majority of Mexicans don't recover from the Depression to the same extent as others. And this is what I mean. People, let's take farm boys, farm girls as well, young people working in the farms in the 1930s. Some of them are sons and daughters of farm owners, some are sons and daughters of tenants, farm renters, some are sons and daughters of laborers. Many of them, increasing numbers of them, leave the farms and go to the cities like Houston. When they go there, they get jobs in places like the Shell refinery. So they make a major improvement in their lives. Unprecedented improvement in their generation is evident. One can see that in any population group. The Mexican who was earning $2 a day picking cotton now all of a sudden is working at Shell and is earning $5 a day. And their job is protected by a union contract. A major advance. But when you compare the mobility rates of the Mexicans with others, you find out that there is a major difference. Consequently, we have what we call uneven development, both among Mexicans relative to Anglos and also within the Mexican population. The Mexican who moves up from the farms into the Shell refinery assumes the laboring occupations. The Anglo farm boys, for the most part, get the skilled occupations. Okay? So though the Mexican makes a major improvement in his life relative to his Mexican brethren who's left in the farm, his mobility rate is not as impressive as that of others. So that we have then a very interesting pattern that was evident really earlier, but particularly evident during the Second World War, and that is that Mexicans are experiencing mobility at different rates, and that Mexicans and Anglos are experiencing mobility at different rates.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask you, clarify something. When you first started talking about the uneven development, you said it was during the First World War. Did you mean during the Second World War?
I meant the Second World War. Sorry. Thank you for clarifying that. Now, if you look at the census, as unreliable as those figures may be, there are trends there that tell you something when you look at the census reports over various decennials. One of the things that's pretty clear is that there is mobility. It's very clear. Just to drive this point further home. If you look at the farm laborer category, for example, in 1930, 2/3 of the Mexican workers were working as farm laborers. 2/3. A good number. By 1970, that figure has been reversed. By 1970, 2/3 of the Mexican workers are at the very top, the white collar and professional, and the skilled and semi-skilled categories. Okay, there's clearly mobility, but when you compare the occupational structure of Mexicans with Anglo workers in places like Texas or other parts of the Southwest, you find out that they too, Anglos too, left the farms. And when you compare the rate at which they left the farms, you find that Anglos are leaving the farms at a faster rate, and that they're entering the skilled occupations at a faster rate. So the census figures are important because they tell us a lot about the trends, but they're unreliable when you look at any particular report any given year. Now, what does this do? At least the experience of mobility. What it means is that the constituency, the natural constituency of the League of United Latin American Citizens, the organization that is stressing an ethnic strategy of incorporation, its constituency has grown, despite the fact that its experience may not be impressive relative to Anglos. I mean, that population group has increased. There's more Mexican-American lawyers, there's more Mexican-American skilled workers, there's more Mexican-American business people, and so forth. Their constituency has grown. Secondly, and very importantly, I think, they have a grievance. They have not experienced mobility at the same rate. A political scientist from Berkeley named Mario Barrera suggested that we think about a segmented social structure. He argues that when Mexicans move up, say from, just to use the general gross categories of farm labor, skilled, unskilled, and white professional, he argues that whenever they move up into another category, they almost always assume the bottom segment of each category. So that the Mexican, for example, who leaves the farm, goes to San Antonio and sets up a little store, he is not going to be a store owner at the same level of the average Anglo store owner. His clientele is going to be poor. So though he moves up into that category, he assumes the bottom segment of that category. So that these people, though they experience mobility, though they do express some grievances based on pretty well-documented information. And their own interviews with them have also corroborated this view that they're particularly, in other words, expectations rise especially during the war. Why do they rise? They rise in part because of the wartime rhetoric of democracy. We're fighting totalitarianism. We will not tolerate that anywhere, including home. There is that rhetoric, and some people believe it. Other people have problems believing it. Mexicans place a great deal of hope in it, much like other minorities. That's one explanation for this rising expectations that then clash with the experience of a lower rate of mobility. The other important, and there are many others, but I'll just mention one more. The war also provides many Mexican Americans an opportunity to fight. And they come back with a very distinguished record. Many of them, of course, including LULAC members, politicize their war contribution and argue Mexicans have made contributions beyond what should be expected of them. They've demonstrated their loyalty. In return, this country should accept them. So their expectations increase as a result of this rhetoric or language of democracy that is promoted during the war, and also because of the wartime contributions. They believe that they deserve equal treatment. And then, of course, they face the problem of continuing discrimination. For many people, for some people who discrimination in the higher occupational levels becomes especially onerous. In other words, they've acculturated, they're experiencing some mobility, and they experience the mobility with the expectation that they're going to be treated differently once they become white-collar workers, and once they get the education, once they serve in the armed forces. When they find out that despite all of this, they continue to face discrimination, it becomes a more serious problem. How else can we explain this? Then the large numbers of Mexican-American professional organizations arguing against discrimination on behalf of the entire population, but for themselves as well. I'll end it there and have a discussion if you have any questions now. Yes?
Was it during this time period that Cesar Chavez was making his wake known?
No. The movement, the farm workers organizing struggle begins in early 60s. But that movement has a history that begins in the early 1900s. Farm workers are organizing in the early 1900s, Anglo, Mexicans, and blacks throughout the country. Farm workers are probably the ones that have been least studied among workers. They're the most exploited in our history, to the extent that the minimum wage law for a long period of time didn't extend them coverage. The National Labor Relations Act didn't accord them the right to unionize, and so forth. They're the lowliest of the low, and despite that, they have a very impressive history of self-organization. A major movement at the turn of the century extending into the 1910s. A resurgence of farm labor activity again occurs in the 1930s and during after the Second World War as well. But we most often associate the farm worker struggle, at least in the Mexican-American community, with the activities led by Cesar Chavez beginning in the middle 60s.
I just have one more question along these same lines. Recently I heard a report on KPFT, I believe it was I don't know if it was the BBC or not, but there was some unrest in California, and the word at this point was that the people that were organizing were treated to a visit by the INS, and the people that were working, the workers, said that the employers had called the INS in to disperse or to deport these folks. I was wondering, do you have any knowledge of the INS being able to come in at the employer's command? Because the INS said, no, we don't come in at the employer's command. It was almost as if the employers were using it as a tool to quell the unrest.
Oh yeah, that's happened. Less, more recently, this doesn't occur. It's not occurring as much now as it used to, but the Immigration Service personnel often did that. On the one hand, they would look away when people were crossing the river during cotton picking time. When the cotton picking time was over, the harvest was over, and the Mexicans were, those that remained, went into places like San Antonio, Los Angeles. That's when they would do the roundups and deport them. Major deportations occur in the 30s, and many of them were again in the 30s when there was a problem of a surplus of labor. They intervened again. In the 50s, and Operation Wetback that's always been a major factor in controlling regulating the labor supply. In immigration policy and the application of immigration law has been serving the purpose of regulating the labor supply. That is its major function. The government, in my mind, has always faced the major quandary of responding to two different constituencies. On the one hand, the agriculturalists have always argued for a lax enforcement of immigration policy. On the other hand, you've got other people that are calling for a more strict enforcement of immigration policy. The government then has to respond to both constituencies. What it does, it basically has a dual immigration policy, a dual enforcement policy. What it does is that it will enforce the policy when necessary, when the critics become very vocal and very visible, it will look the other way. Generally speaking, during the 20th century, when agriculturalists require and demand more labor, like they did during the Second World War. In the Second World War, what happens? The farmers are saying, look, you want us to produce more cotton? You need to make sure we have these workers. And we can't afford to continue operating the way we've been operating, where we just allow the labor force to migrate on its own. We have to regulate that flow. You need to bring me X number of workers on the day that I want them. So the government, in effect, becomes a labor contractor. They institutionalize the control of the labor flow by instituting the labor importation program that we call the Bracero program. Established in 42, it ended in 64. This labor importation program, the Bracero program, is the institutionalization of the process of controlling the labor flow. Okay, in other words, the government, there's many agriculturalists are taking numerous measures to make sure that they get the workers that they need. In 42, they convinced the government to assist them. The government is really caught in between two constituencies, and we have an apparent contradiction, a seeming contradiction. It's not a contradiction. It's part of a dual immigration policy, in my mind. Did you have a question?
Along with like what you're saying about the dual contradiction, it seems like there's also two different things going on with it. On the one hand, there's the labor coming in and being needed by the railroad workers and the cotton farmers, and that's being like exploited by those individuals. But it still sounds like it's also, on the other hand, the responsibility of the government, the United States government, to ensure that there isn't any exploitation of individuals.
Well, yeah, one solution some people have offered on behalf of the Mexican workers, not only the Mexican nationals that are crossing over without papers, but also the domestic workers somehow are impacted by their presence, is to enforce a minimum wage law. That is one solution that has been proposed. If you think about it, it's a sensible solution. In other words, if you make sure that people pay the minimum wage, then there won't be an incentive to hire people as cheap workers, which is what is occurring when they hire people that come in without documentation from Mexico. Of course, it means that we will pay more when people cut our grass and cut our lawns, and when we go to the restaurants and so forth.
Can you just relate the Bracero program to what you were discussing here about LULAC and the shifting identity from a Mexicanist to a more Mexican American, and what was the Mexican American response to the Bracero program in terms of identity issues?
Well, LULAC was one of the strongest critics of U.S. immigration policy, and it was one of the strongest critics of the Bracero program in particular, as well as the presence of undocumented workers. LULAC became very, very controversial for that reason. It was LULAC, again, the very prominent national organization, speaking as a Mexican-American organization, is saying, look, we're not opposed to Mexicans as such. Obviously, we're Mexicans ourselves. We're opposed to the exploitation of Mexican nationals who are being brought in without documentation. They're being brought in without documentation, meaning that they're vulnerable to exploitation. That is not right. We're opposed to the lack of enforcement of immigration laws for that reason. In addition, to the extent that the presence of those workers from Mexico depress wages and displace workers, that is affecting the Mexican-American population, the population group that we represent. So for that added reason, we're against it. And they accuse the government of being racist for allowing this to continue, knowing full well that it was impacting in a very particular way the Mexican-American group. The criticism, however, against LULAC, in all fairness to the critics, is that given the kind of political environment, this kind of criticism could be manipulated in ways that worked against the interest of Mexican people. Okay? It only reinforced anti-Mexican ideas, in other words. Okay? Well, thank you very much. I hope you continue expressing your interest in Mexican-American history. There's a number of works, very fine works available for you to read on a number of topics. Please consult your library and read as much as you can. Thank you very much.